Today is March 3rd, 2026. This is day 4 of the U.S. launched war of aggression on Iran. People have to remember, I am based in Southeast Asia. I'm about 12 hours ahead of the U.S. Eastern Standard Time. So from my perspective, it is day 4 of these military operations. And I want to point out 2 posts that I have made since I published my last video yesterday. And if you go over here to X, but I also published this on my post section on YouTube and also on Telegram, I have 2 posts here. One is about why China is not intervening to stop the US war of aggression against Iran. I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But first, I want to address what is going on with this conflict against Iran right now. Right now, as we speak, Iran continues to carry out regional military operations, highly coordinated, very effective, long-range ballistic missile and drone strikes across the entire region, striking as far as Israel, Jordan. This is on the furthest reach of the Middle East, toward the Mediterranean Sea. They're also striking U.S. military facilities and now economic facilities within U.S. proxy nations closer to Iran itself. Nations like Bahrain, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. So let me just read through this. Well, you can go find it there. I will read through this, and then I will add additional information when and if necessary. U.S. strikes are still ongoing. Yes, the U.S., together with Israel, they're still carrying out significant strikes all across Iran. And you can see them doing significant damage inside Tehran, the capital of Iran itself. U.S. strikes are still ongoing. Reports claim police stations and internal security facilities are being targeted, meaning the U.S. is still shaping the conflict for anticipated U.S.-backed violence in hopes to trigger across Iran via traitors and terrorists. Defectors that the U.S. has convinced to work against Iran and its self-preservation, and also terrorists that the U.S. has been cultivating, arming, backing, training, bringing into the country over the course of not just days or weeks, but they have been doing this for years, even decades. They have entire groups of militants and terrorists inside Iran and along its borders that they have been using against Iran for decades. People always ask me, why do the Iranians say death to America, death to America? The United States has been waging a war against Iran for decades, since the Iranians rightfully overthrew the US-installed puppet regime, running Iran like a modern-day colony back in the 1970s. That means that the United States didn't just hope to decapitate the political and military leadership and then magically the government would collapse. They also have a plan to attempt to degrade internal security as well as degrade Iran's defensive military capabilities in the hopes of using these groups that they have been cultivating over years and decades, using these groups to fully and completely topple the government internally, and then perhaps create opportunities to apply even more military pressure externally. So until this plan is fully implemented, that means when the US feels like it has degraded Iranian internal security sufficiently and they decide to trigger this attempt to overwhelm Iran internally, its internal security, until this plan is fully implemented and then neutralized by Iran. You have to wait for internal Iranian security forces to see this operation take place and fully neutralize it. Iran will still face serious challenges in the hours and days ahead. Until this plays out, we have no idea which way this is actually going, to go. As of now, Iran's Mosaic defense strategy, I continuously refer to Iran's Mosaic defense strategy again. A painting is one single big picture. You look at it, it is one picture painted across a single canvas. A mosaic is a picture comprised of many tiny individual tiles all added up together, and they make a full picture. So Iran has a Mosaic defense strategy. They've taken their central military command And they have broken it up into dozens of very significant regional military commands. That means if you cut communications to Central Command, all of these other regional military commands will continue operating independently. They know what they need to do. They have logistics and support and intelligence operating on their behalf, independent of Central Command. They can continue operating. They can continue operating on their own. They can continue operating with whatever other regional commands they're able to communicate with. This also means almost certainly that the Central Command, while the U.S. decapitated its senior leadership, they've struck the physical buildings that they operate in. Almost certainly, they've decentralized the Central Command itself. Elements from it have been distributed across this Mosaic defense, these regional military commands. And this Mosaic defense strategy is allowing Iran to continue carrying out sophisticated, well-organized, effective regional military operations. Striking U.S. military bases across the region constantly for days now is not a trivial achievement. It is not something that you could do if you had truly crippled Iran's military capabilities, its leadership, and its capabilities. This indicates that the Mosaic defense strategy was well prepared and is still working successfully. But did you know that Iran also has a Mosaic defense strategy for internal security as well? They have an internal security apparatus that they have decentralized almost down to the neighborhood level, not just city and district, but neighborhood level. And they are meant to operate no matter how badly the centralized internal security forces are degraded by these U.S. strikes. The U.S. and Israel are attacking Iranian media broadcasting stations, static facilities out in the open. Everybody knows where the headquarters of Iranian state media are, and the U.S. and Israel are bombing them. But again, because of the Mosaic defense strategy for internal continuity of leadership and security, they have mobile transmitters. They have radio and TV station relays that are mobile, that they can move around to where they are needed when these static, very well-known positions, which will inevitably be struck, that they knew would be struck, were struck last time, to make up for this and compensate for this. The question now is, how long can this Mosaic defense strategy work in terms of retaliating against U.S. military aggression against Iran externally across the region, dealing damage not just to U.S. bases, but now Iran is targeting the economic facilities of nations like Qatar. Liquid natural gas reportedly has been temporarily shut down. This is liquid natural gas Europe absolutely depends on. They're striking refinery facilities that are refining petrochemicals from the region required for these refined products that are exported, many of them to Europe and other U.S. proxies, say Japan, South Korea, and East Asia. Yes, some of this will disrupt energy flows to China, but it's still too early to tell who this is going to hurt most. The U.S. and its proxies, not the U.S. itself, but because the U.S. depends so much on its network of proxies, this might degrade U.S. capabilities themselves. The U.S. itself is very energy independent. The United States is not trying to take over the Middle East and control it, to take the oil for its own use. It wants to control who has access to this oil, specifically to deny it to China. So all of this is taking place externally. How long will that continue? That remains to be seen. The Mosaic defense strategy for internal security within Iran, how successful will this be against almost certainly pre-planned operations the U.S. has put into place and is waiting to implement to try to destabilize and overthrow Iran internally? How long does the internal and external Mosaic defense strategy hold out versus the magazine depth of the United States in terms of its offensive weapons and also its anti-missile munitions? That is what we are looking at. This is what we have to look out for. So that is that. Let's go back to why China isn't intervening to stop a U.S. war of aggression against Iran. Now, I've said that Destroying Iran, toppling Iran is a prerequisite for the US to then pivot, and it will do so very quickly, to a direct confrontation with China. The US has probably less than 5 years if it wants to maintain primacy over the globe, prevent the rise of China, the reemergence of Russia, has probably less than 5 years to do this before China's rise is completely irreversible, regardless of what the US does and regardless of where it does it. So I have a list here of reasons why China cannot, it's not a matter of is not, cannot intervene militarily in the Middle East. China's military is built to defend China within and along its borders against a massive and growing US military buildup all along its peripheries, ongoing for decades. This is a map. US military bases in East Asia. China is surrounded by US forces, tens of thousands of them, in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and right here, the island province of Taiwan, which is actually internationally recognized and even recognized by the US State Department itself officially as part of China. It also hosts US military forces. So China is completely surrounded by US forces. The US, as I've reported on for years, is attempting to overthrow and transform Southeast Asia into a Ukraine-style proxy directed against China with mixed results. And don't forget, north of China, where China is receiving huge amounts of Russian energy exports through pipelines, the United States right now, admittedly, through Ukraine, is carrying out long-range drone strikes on Russian energy production, specifically to cripple it and inhibit oil exports, energy exports from Russia to everywhere, and especially to China. There is a Belt and Road Initiative pipeline running through Myanmar. The US seeks to close off all of these straits, prevent hydrocarbons from the Middle East from crossing through this strait and going to China. So China has built a pipeline here, so those ships can come here, offload in Myanmar, be sent across the oil, the hydrocarbons sent across the pipeline to China. The US has armed militants waging war against the central government in Myanmar, and they are specifically attacking that pipeline. And right here is Pakistan, right at the edge of the map, just east of India. There's also pipelines and Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure allowing China to bypass US blockades that the US is preparing to implement in this region. And the US has been backing militants, attacking, killing Chinese engineers and local security forces working on that infrastructure as well. So China is also completely surrounded by tens of thousands of US forces, US proxies, US destabilization, the proxy war the US is waging against Myanmar through these militants is also directed at China itself. So they are in their own predicament, just as Iran is, just as Russia is. They do not have a military that is just free to go anywhere around the world without consequence, because first and foremost, they need to defend against this military buildup against China that has been ongoing for decades. If you listen to Carl Zah, who I've had on my channel in the past and whose channel I've gone on in the past, he has talked about the history of US encirclement of China following World War II, where the US was actually bombing mainland China at various points and threatening all-out war with China at various points in history, before we've reached this sort of equilibrium and standoff that exists today. And China remembers all of that. If people at home on the internet do not, China remembers that. They understand what is at stake here. So that is one reason why China cannot just send its military to the Middle East. They have their own obligations to defend China itself, which is under imminent threat by the US. Chinese forces are organized around hardware designed specifically for this purpose, not to project military power abroad, around the globe, like the US does. And the US has these capabilities simply and solely because it is an aggressor, not for national defense. So in other words, why does the US have such a huge fleet of aerial refueling planes? Because that's what you need to do to project military power around the globe. That's not what you need to do to protect American shores and territory. That's what you need to do when you're an empire and you're trying to invade countries halfway around the globe or all the way around the globe. China has not developed these capabilities because it has no ambition to be a global empire. Its military is designed specifically to protect China, and these capabilities cannot simply be taken and pivoted to launching a war halfway around the world in the Middle East. China literally has no ability to project the military power required to confront and successfully stop a full-scale U.S. war of aggression on the other side of the planet with the capabilities it has for national defense. It can send ships to the Middle East. It could send a small number of troops to the Middle East. It could send all of these things to the Middle East, but they would be utterly ineffective. They would be completely outnumbered and outperformed by the extensive network that the U.S. has built up in the region militarily over decades. People have to understand, this is not a Hollywood movie where a leader picks up the phone, tells the military to go, and then in the next scene, they're going into action. It does not work that way. It takes, to project military power far from your own territory, it can take several years to be able to do this if you don't already have bases there and ready to implement this. Number two, in order to launch this war on Iran, the U.S. spent decades building up a network of global and regional bases, logistical networks, ammunition depots, fuel dumps, regional integrated air defense capabilities, etc., to first encircle Iran, then attack it. And you need to have all of these things to conduct a successful military operation of this type. And China would require a similar network in order to launch a military operation of this type, or to counter a military operation of this type. You need global logistical networks to support the regional logistical networks in the Middle East itself. People have to understand this. Every troop you send is not just, again, in a Hollywood movie with his gun, he's ready to go, and he just goes from scene to scene to scene fighting, and that's it, and that's all there is to it. A soldier requires food, water, clothing, housing, ammunition, medical treatment, and infantry soldiers require all kinds of additional support, armor, air power, air defense, and then all of these things require an army of people to supply, maintain, and operate, and then all of those people need people to help support them. You look at a military base, it is essentially a city of sorts with power generation, waste management, food. They have places where the individual personnel can go and buy things, personal things that they need day to day. All of these things have to be accounted for, or you cannot launch a successful military operation. China would be required to create an equal or greater network throughout the region to stop this, and this simply is impossible because it would require years to do. By the time China established the network required to stop the US attacking Iran, the war would be over one way or the other. Number three, the US built its network up through both politically capturing nations in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, in the case of Israel, just artificially creating the country in the first place, and invading, occupying them, including nations like Iraq and Syria. China simply doesn't conduct its foreign policy this way, because if it did, it would be just as bad as the US itself, and then there would be no point for it to go into the region to contest the US war of aggression, because it itself would be interested in projecting not just military power into the region, but political control over it. And that simply isn't how China does business, which is an irony, because the US always accuses China of doing this in fiction, while the US openly does it in reality. Number four, if you think China could simply project military power over the horizon, and in other words, okay, China doesn't have military bases in the region, why not just send ships and warplanes from China, just have them fly to the Middle East? This is also absolutely, utterly absurd. It demonstrates no understanding at all of how modern aviation works or how modern combat works. So let's get into that a little bit. This requires huge amounts of long-range aircraft, immense aerial refueling capabilities, which the US has, China does not, specifically because the US seeks to project military power around the globe. China does not. And long-range munitions, as well as forward bases at least near the region to do so. So even if they are conducting over-the-horizon operations, they would still need military bases somewhat close to the region. You cannot just launch sorties from China, reach the Middle East, conduct a military operation, and then fly all the way back to China. It doesn't work that way. There are no aircraft capable of doing that on any scale that would tip the balance in favor of Iran and its allies. Sending naval vessels would simply place them at the mercy of a better prepared and more extensive military position the US has established over decades, as explained above. I've heard people say, why doesn't China has several carrier groups? Why doesn't it just send one to the region and fight with the United States? Because the US has many times more ships, aircraft, and facilities in the region that would overwhelm that carrier group, and the carrier group would end up at the bottom of the ocean. Even if it caused significant damage, it would still end up at the losing end. You don't just send forces and have them go fight. You need to have equal or greater forces in order to have the decisive impact on the conflict. You sent these vessels there, the US would have a better chance of neutralizing them before they were able to tilt the battle in Iran's favor. Again, that is just reality. Number 5, what China has likely done is all that it could do. Provide economic support against illegal US sanctions. They've been doing this for years. Provide technical material support for Iran's military industrial production. If China was not providing this, Iran probably would have collapsed already. Both of these areas of support. Iran would probably have collapsed already. China can also provide military support through the transfer of weapons and equipment. All of these have their limits, especially in terms of the transfer of military equipment to Iran, which takes years to train Iranian personnel on effectively. Okay? You could send Chinese or Russian warplanes to Iran today, and by the end of the week, experienced Iranian pilots might be able to take off and land in these aircraft, maybe, but to use them effectively against a very experienced and massive US Air Force, air assets, and also air defense assets, you require years of training and practice, not just flying the aircraft themselves individually, flying them together in coordinated operations, and then coordinating those type of operations together with combined arms operations. Again, this can take years up to a decade to do properly. Look at Ukraine. The US and its proxies in Europe sent F-16s. There's no way for Ukrainian pilots to get into these and operate them effectively. Even if you had foreign pilots come in and fly the F-16s, they're still flying from Ukraine, from infrastructure that pre-exists in Ukraine. You still have to build it up, change it, optimize it for those warplanes, and that takes time. It cannot be done overnight. And I mentioned this last point regarding the amount of time it takes to effectively integrate new military hardware into a military is exactly why Ukraine has failed to absorb and fully utilize floods of Western weapons and equipment in the US proxy war on Russia being waged there. That is exactly why, because, and I've explained this, to build a brigade of 4,000 men, it could take up to 3 years to do this properly if you're starting from not from scratch. But if you're just going to build a new brigade out of the forces that you have and out of raw recruits coming in to fill the lowest levels of that brigade, it could take up to 3 years. If you are losing large numbers of officers, non-commissioned officers, experienced leadership at all levels of the brigade, then it will take even longer and probably will actually be impossible to build an effective brigade at that point. So again, these are all realities people just don't think about because their understanding of modern warfare comes from Hollywood movies, not from studying actual modern warfare, the realities of modern warfare. Conclusion. There are real-world limitations to what nations like Russia and China can do against US wars of aggression elsewhere, especially considering the fact that the US is waging proxy war on both Russia and China at the same time it wages direct war on Iran. Russia already tried to intervene in a conflict in the Middle East to turn the tide against US proxy war and direct aggression, Syria. And for a time they were successful. They were successful because the Soviet Union for decades had already made inroads into the region, including Syria. There was an existing base that Russia was already using in Syria. This is what allowed them to do that. And despite doing that, and despite holding out for so long in Syria, Syria eventually collapsed because the US also launched a war, a proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. And then Russia was forced to take its existing resources and pick, do we prop up Syria or do we ensure victory in Ukraine? Which one is our priority? Obviously, Ukraine, it's right on our border. If we have to pick one, we will have to pick Ukraine, no choice. And this is why Syria collapsed. Russia was overextended, and it's not their fault. This is the reality of the circumstances US global war of aggression has placed on nations like Russia, on nations like China. They are forcing them to make difficult decisions, and they are making these difficult decisions with the long-term outlook in mind. Russia and China are doing what is realistic and within their capabilities and are constantly expanding their own capabilities in order to do more when possible. And they will do more when possible, but they cannot do more than is possible. Do not confuse real limitations with a lack of concern or will. Both Russia and China know that once Iran collapses, that is the US one step closer to encircling and containing both Russia and then ultimately China. They know this. They've been preparing for this for years. The limitation is not an understanding of the situation or will regarding the situation. It is the reality of creating the conditions necessary to truly defend against this. And they are thinking long-term, not short-term. They have to ignore their pride and a desire for revenge or justice and think about long-term survival, self-preservation, even if that comes at the cost of an ally, because if they were to make an emotionally driven decision to intervene on Iran's behalf, not only do they have a high likelihood of failing, but they will make themselves more vulnerable and in the long term compromise multipolarism as a whole in the process. So we have to think about this. This is exactly like a chess game. Someone takes one of your high value pieces, you're angry, you want to get immediate revenge against them, and so you make an impulsive move which turns out to have been a trap, and then you end up losing the game. Or you just bite the bullet, understand that you lost that high piece, that high value piece, and objectively, strategically rework your strategy in a way that best ensures your overall survival to the end of the game, foregoing that emotional desire for revenge in the heat of the moment. So do not confuse real limitations with a lack of concern or will, and realize blaming Russia or China for a US war of aggression simply serves Washington's agenda, not Iran's or any of its allies. The dream of the United States at this point is to not only wage a war of aggression against Iran and try to blame it on Israel or pretend that somehow this was all unilaterally decided by the Trump administration and has nothing to do with continuity of agenda and the system that is the US economy and government in terms of Wall Street and Washington. The greatest success they could possibly imagine is also having people who oppose their aggression abroad, have them start blaming Russia and China for it instead of keeping the blame squarely on Wall Street and Washington. That is their greatest dream, and this is the agenda people are serving by blaming China and Russia, people who have not thought this out, the reality of logistics. Now, I just want to show you a few other images. These are just random images that I was looking at to try to help people out there understand the complexities of launching a military operation far from their own shores. This, let's just pretend this is where all of the material, equipment, arms, and ammunition is coming from. You have to remember there's a huge nation, even international network that is feeding all of the equipment, arms, and ammunition into the warehouses where it is distributed for use by US forces overseas. And they show a little truck going, but the little truck is going to a port. From the port, it's being put onto a ship. The ship is going to another port, and then there's trucks from that port bringing it to base depots, major base depots in regions, and then it is distributed to smaller bases closer to the front, and then it is distributed even closer to, say, forward operating bases, and then from there it is distributed to the front line. And again, just moving these supplies requires an army of logistic personnel. people driving trucks, people fixing trucks, people fueling the trucks, people looking over the fuel for the trucks, people feeding, all of the people operating the trucks and overseeing the fuel and maintaining them. Just that in and of itself is a massive logistics feat, just to get all of these supplies flowing from one side of the planet to the other. Here's another one showing you from factory to port to front line. Again, just to give you an idea that there's many steps that need to be taken, and it requires networks that take years to build up. You cannot just do this overnight. And again, I'm just showing you these pictures to show you that the president of China doesn't just pick up a phone and tell the military to go, and then they just show up in the next scene fighting the Americans. You need to put every single thing in a box. Every single box needs to be put on a truck by personnel. This vehicle right here requires fuel and maintenance and shelter when it's not being used. So does this truck. All of these people that you see in this picture require housing and food and water and medicine, etc., etc. And then when it gets to the port, you have ships. A ship in and of itself requires huge amounts of maintenance. It requires fuel. It requires its own network of support to ensure that it can do what it needs to do to move all of these supplies from one place to the other. An air bridge, which is easier to implement if you have a huge airlift component, which America does and China not so much. China has huge airlift capabilities, but it's still dwarfed by America's airlift capability because America developed its airlift capability to project military power worldwide. China built its airlift capability to project power around China and its peripheries. Okay, so you need huge amounts of planes. Again, the planes require pilots, maintenance, fuel, housing, everything all in and of itself. There's an army of people required to operate these planes, and then you're moving the supplies on and off them also requires an army of people to do. And of course, you need airfields, you need warehouses to put the supplies, to stage it, to put it on the plane, and when it gets to its destination, put it to where it can then be distributed throughout the theater of operation. Warehouses, okay, this is inside of a warehouse. This shows you a basic military base. Someone had to build all of this. And someone has to maintain all of this, and someone has to supply everything you see here every day with everything it needs to operate effectively, day to day and year to year. Helicopters do not fly to theater. Chinese pilots aren't just going to get into helicopters and fly to the Middle East to go fight the Americans. The helicopters have to be, to a certain degree, disassembled so they fit into the airlift component, the airlift airframe. And then they have to be brought to wherever they're going. And then facilities there need to be established to maintain them, fuel them, repair them, and again, house and take care of the pilots and the maintenance crews and everyone else involved in their day-to-day operation. And again, another warehouse. So when you think about doing a military operation halfway around the world from China, or the US conducting a military operation on the other side of the planet, say off the shores of China, this is what goes into making that possible. The US spent decades building the networks necessary to do this, and the US still fears that it has not done enough. For China to just decide and then deploy military forces within a week or a month or even a year, they have no possibility of ever creating sufficient concentration of forces and in any part of the world, say Iran or for Venezuela, to stop the United States. All they will do is waste resources, overextend themselves, and make the possibility of the US overwhelming China within its own borders and along its periphery, making that all that much more possible. So please keep this in mind before you become emotional and you want to blame someone. Do not blame China. Do not blame Russia. They are doing absolutely everything they can do for Iran. They're all in the same boat together with Iran. They all are acutely aware of this. If you need to blame somebody, blame Wall Street, blame Washington. That's who you blame. Those are the people who maliciously and deliberately decided to attack Iran. Please don't blame China for not falling on its own sword to carry out an ineffective operation to try to save Iran, which will almost certainly fail, and then compromise China's own self-preservation itself. This is what's required to run a nation state and operate within the realities of geopolitics. It is not ideal. It is also not a place for human emotions. If you're easily driven by human emotions, excited by human emotions, you're not cut out for understanding geopolitics, and certainly not cut out for navigating through them. Luckily, the leadership in Russia, China, even Iran, to a certain extent, have demonstrated an ability to do this. That is the video for today. I will continue keeping an eye on this. I know I said I wasn't going to do videos every single day, but I have done a video every single day, but that might not remain the case. Again, if you want to follow daily updates from me regarding this, please do follow me on X. I'm also on Telegram. I post on YouTube. I post videos here, but if you go to actually where it says posts, I will post things there day to day, even if I don't put up a video. So in the video description, if you go to my videos, you come down here, there's the video description, you click on more, and it expands. There will be links to everything that I reference in the video. There will also be all of the places you can find and follow my work. And because I do not monetize any of my social media platforms, if ads pop up, feel free to skip them. I do not put them there, and I'm not benefiting from them. Please feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. The links are right here in the video description of every single video that I publish. Everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping like, share, kind comments, news tips, all of that greatly helps. Just liking, sharing, and posting a comment helps boost the content and gets the information out to more people. All of that collectively helps and makes this work possible. I sincerely thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.